The idea first came about as a kind of a response to what I was seeing around Melbourne, about what artists were doing with colour around Melbourne. There was, in the last couple of years, quite a lot of shows that use this kind of really intense, lurid colour, and quite a lot of it, and quite a lot of discordant colour arrangements. So there was not only this interest that I wanted to kind of draw on and kind of grab a couple of these artists, put them together and see what happens, but there was also another aesthetic that I thought was quite interesting that went along with the colour, and that was a kind of a faux mysticism in people's work. There was a lot of, or there is a lot of kind of semi-talismanic works, or work that has a kind of shrine-like quality. And so I wanted to see how colour is being used to kind of create these semi-mystical objects. And so the artists in this show I knew about from their own individual practices. Kira's work, for example, I think I first came across it in 2006, and it was very different then, but it still had this kind of quality of patches of lurid psychedelic colour, and she obviously had an interest in the spiritual or something occultish or mystical. And Nick Selnich's work, the same, particularly these works. They have a very strong talisman or mandala quality. Valentina's work I've known for a long time, same as Paul's. And so I was interested in how these artists might work together, and how all of these talismans or shrines could read as a kind of a very colourful investigation of the spiritual or the metaphysical. And so that's kind of how the idea came about. One of the key texts, I suppose, one of the key readings for me was a book by David Batchelor, who's a British artist, called Chromophobia. And the book's about how in Western thought over the last several thousand years, there's this kind of niggling, insidious aversion to colour, and how white is aligned with purity, and black and white, line, form, always has a dominance in Western art over colour. And so Batchelor aligns colour, because modernism generally aligns colour with the primitive, the infantile, things that are exotic. He aligns colour with these things. And he calls this aversion chromophobia, which is the title of his book. So I was interested in the opposite of chromophobia, which is kind of a love of colour, or a real intense interest in colour. And so that was kind of a key thinking point for this show. Nick's work over here, his work generally talks about, he touches on modernism and about geometric abstraction. He's very interested in geometric abstraction and how that can be used in a contemporary sense, and also the human element in geometric abstraction. And so he plays with ideas of play and games, but these particular works for this show use currency symbols from around the world, but they're kind of drawn in radiating pools of colour. And so the colour itself tends to be a disintegrating element. It works against the symbols, so the more colour there is, the harder they are to read. And so there's this kind of dichotomy of colour and symbolism. So that's why I was particularly interested in Nick's work for this show. Valentina's work has a real sense of ritual in a lot of her work. She does a lot of casting, and even though that's kind of ritualistic in itself, she does very interesting things to her casts once they're made. She binds them, as with this piece, and she binds them with lots and lots of colourful objects. She adorns them, she gives them a real decorative quality. And so they end up like charms, so they have a kind of a potency, a kind of magical potency, just because of the repetitive labour that's gone into them. So this idea of repetition or an obsessive labour practice really runs through the whole show. Kira Jamison's work involves this very repetitious, obsessive layering of colour into lots and lots of different shapes that, when combined, form into this web. And a lot of her work does that. She uses this process to draw all these different forms. I think the reason that repetitious making practices are important for the show is that for these artists in particular, for these works, it's through repetition that there's a kind of, in a way, a loss of self. And so it's through psychedelic colour and through kind of these ritualistic making practices that there's a loss of objectivity, and perhaps the work can talk about intuition and something beyond the rational through these kind of repetitive practices that make you lose yourself in the practice. Paul's work is very idiosyncratic, and it uses the same process of accumulation of colour, but it takes it to the extreme. He uses bits and pieces of trash, really, to construct these strange shrine objects. He does a lot of other things. He does painting and mixed media installation and lots of other things, but this is kind of the stalwart of his practice. This is the cornerstone of his practice. And so it wasn't only colour that I was interested in, but how colour is used in a kind of process of accumulation, so in a slow process of gathering up lots and lots of discordant bits of colour into these harmonious compositions that have a kind of magical presence almost, or a faux magical presence. I mean, Paul's work has a kind of, he is not really making fun, but they are very playful works. And so they have a kind of neo-shamanistic quality, but at the same time they're very playful, and they definitely don't take themselves too seriously. Same as Nick's work, and the same as all the work in the show.